Welcome to the Deep Dive, and today we're going to be tackling a pretty meaty philosophical concept, one that I know is going to be right up your alley as a philosopher.
Yeah.
It's the distinction between doing harm and allowing harm.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I know at first glance it might seem kind of straightforward, like, okay, is there really that much to talk about here?
Yeah.
But trust me, this is one of those things in philosophy, you start digging into it, and it just gets more and more complex the deeper you go.
Absolutely.
And you've provided us with some really cool excerpts, actually, from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So we're going to be using that to guide this
Excellent.
deep dive.
Yeah, and it's something that has, tentacles that reach far beyond the halls of academia. I mean, this really does touch upon huge real-world issues. You think about euthanasia, warfare, global poverty.
Oh, yeah.
All of these are informed by how we answer this question.
So let's just start with that very basic question then. Is there a genuine moral difference between actively causing harm and passively letting it happen?
Yeah.
I mean, if the outcome is the same, does the method really matter from an ethical standpoint?
That's the crux of the dilemma. And, philosophers have been debating this for centuries.
Right.
It forces us to examine the very nature of agency, responsibility, consequences of our choices, both active and passive.
So let's try to illustrate this a little bit with maybe like a classic thought experiment. So imagine a person drowning. Is pushing them in morally equivalent to simply not throwing them a life preserver?
Yeah. This is the classic question of action versus inaction.
Right.
And it seems intuitive to believe that actively causing harm, doing something to harm someone, is worse than merely failing to prevent harm. But, is that intuition really justified?
Right.
Or is that just a product of sort of our emotional responses rather than some deep, reasoned ethical principles?
Okay. So how have philosophers tried to untangle this? What are some of the ways they've gone about this?
Well, one common approach is what's called the contrast strategy, which is, we use contrasting examples to test our intuitions and see, do the lines blur or do they hold firm?
Right.
And a classic example of this is called the bathtub case, made famous by James Rachels.
Oh, yeah. The bathtub case.
Yeah.
I remember that one from ethics class. That always sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah.
Maybe you could refresh our listeners' memory on exactly what that case is.
Absolutely. So there are these two scenarios. In one scenario, an individual intentionally drowns a child in a bathtub. In the other scenario, the individual witnesses the child accidentally fall into a bathtub and drown, but does nothing to intervene. So same outcome, right?
Right.
Child dies in both cases.
Yeah.
One involves direct action and one involves inaction. And Rachel's argued that, if we intuitively judge the first scenario to be morally worse, he thinks our intuitions are flawed because, again, same outcome, child's death, the intent in both cases could be the same to see the child dead.
That's a really dark example, but I can see how it sort of gets to the heart of this issue of like, is there a difference or is it just that, we see action as being somehow more dramatic?
Right.
So are we swayed by that?
Yeah, is it just a matter of our psychology or is there something deeply morally relevant about that distinction?
Okay, so then, but even with these very stark examples, I mean, the contrast strategy still has critics.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, one criticism that you might level against these cases is that, are they really controlling for all relevant factors?
Right.
I mean, for instance, the philosopher Francis Combe argues that the manner in which the harm is brought about, is morally relevant. Mm-hmm. The act of pushing the child into the tub, she says, involves a violation that goes beyond simply failing to rescue them. You're violating their bodily integrity in some way.
Right.
So there's this kind of harm that's present in the doing case that's not present in the allowing case.
So it's not just about the outcome. It's also about the actual act itself.
Yeah, it's about the nature of the act itself. Yeah.
That's interesting. So that suggests maybe just comparing the outcomes isn't enough to establish like a universal kind of principle here.
Yeah. And this is why I think we need to delve deeper into the conceptual frameworks surrounding doing and allowing. It's not just enough to compare outcomes. We've got to really dissect what these terms mean, how they relate to agency, and what distinguishes them at a very fundamental level.
So let's unpack that then. Let's actually look at these terms.
Yeah.
What are some of the key attempts to define the distinction between doing and allowing?
Well, one very prominent approach focuses on causation. The idea is that doing harm implies actively causing it.
Okay.
Whereas allowing harm suggests a more passive role. Seems straightforward, right?
Right.
but it gets really muddled really quickly.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't water your plants and they die, you haven't physically harmed them, but your lack of action has caused their demise.
Yeah, so is that a doing or an allowing? So, causation, which seems like an intuitive starting point, actually,
Right.
doesn't always align neatly with our moral intuition.
Okay. So if causation isn't like the silver bullet, what other avenues have philosophers looked at?
Well, another approach involves counterfactuals, exploring what would have happened if the agent hadn't existed.
Okay.
So, suppose we have this case where a king allows his brother to starve even though he could easily provide food. If the king had never existed, the brother might have inherited the throne and lived a prosperous life.
Right.
So, does this counterfactual scenario, absolve the king of responsibility?
That's interesting. I mean, but it seems like you could get into some pretty wild thought experiments with the counterfactuals.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope.
You can't always predict, how a chain of events would have unfolded.
It gets highly speculative very quickly.
So maybe not the best way.
Mm.
So if causation and counterfactuals aren't quite cutting it, what other tools are there in the philosopher's toolbox when trying to figure this out?
Well, one framework that I find compelling is one that's offered by Philippa Foot, who suggested it's about interfering with a sequence of events. So doing involves setting in motion this harmful sequence of events,
Okay.
whereas allowing means failing to interrupt a sequence that's already in progress.
I like that. That
It-
seems to make sense, right? It brings in this element of time and process, right? So
Mhm.
if you push someone in a river, you're kind of starting that whole...
You're initiating it.
Yeah. And if you see someone struggling, you're not doing anything. You're just kind of letting that existing sequence unfold. Is that kind of the gist of it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Foot's framework, I think, provides a much more concrete way to differentiate between doing and allowing. It focuses on the agent's role in that causal chain of events.
And this idea of sequences ties in really nicely, actually, to the idea of positive versus negative rights, right? I know Warren Quinn talks about that.
Absolutely.
I think.
Yeah, so Quinn argued that, doing often involves violating negative rights. These are rights not to be interfered with. Whereas allowing often involves violating positive rights. These are rights to receive aid or assistance. So there's this nice symmetry there.
Right. So negative is don't interfere with me. Positive is help me.
Exactly.
Okay. So, I mean, that distinction between the types of rights adds a whole other level of complexity to this.
Oh, absolutely.
It makes us ask, well, which ones are more important and when?
Yeah, it's a very important framework for evaluating moral dilemmas that extends, far beyond the realm of, hypothetical thought experiments. I mean, this really has implications for how we think about healthcare, social justice, international relations.
This is already getting complicated.
Oh, yeah.
And we've covered a lot of ground. I feel like we're really just kind of scratching the surface here.
We are just getting started.
There's so much more to dig into, especially when it comes to, what are the real thorny problems? What are some of the new twists on this? And even are there experimental approaches to this whole philosophical puzzle?
Oh, yeah.
So I think we'll pause here, let our listeners sort of digest all of this, but don't go anywhere because in part 2, we're going to be diving into those thorny problems, the new twists, maybe even some experimental philosophy to shake things up a little bit.
All this talk about sequences and rights, it kind of leads us naturally to another very famous philosophical thought experiment, the trolley problem.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The trolley problem. I'm sure many philosophers has lost sleep over this one. And it's one of those that really seems to capture the imagination, even for people who aren't, super into philosophy.
It really does. It has a way of cutting through the abstract and just presenting this very stark, visceral dilemma. It really forces us to confront our moral intuitions head on.
So for our listener who maybe isn't as familiar with this thought experiment, can you kind of set the stage a little bit?
Sure. So imagine a runaway trolley barreling down the tracks. Ahead, you see 5 people tied to the rails, unable to move. You're standing by a lever. If you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a side track. But on that side track, there's one person tied to the rails. So you have a choice. Do nothing. The trolley kills the 5 people, or intervene, pull the lever, actively cause the death of one person to save the 5. What do you do?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really tough choice. I think it highlights that tension between, we don't want to cause harm, but we also want to minimize harm.
Right.
It's tempting to just see this as, oh, this is just another doing gallowing problem.
Right.
But I have a feeling it's a little more nuanced than that.
You're absolutely right. It's not just about doing versus allowing. It forces us to grapple with the relative weight of different ethical principles.
Okay, so unpack that for me a little bit. How does it go beyond that kind of simple dichotomy?
Well, the trolley problem challenges us to consider whether minimizing harm always trumps the principle of not directly causing harm. So if you pull the lever, you're actively causing that one person's death, even if it's to save 5 others. If you do nothing, 5 people die. But it's through inaction on your part. So, which choice aligns with a stronger moral imperative? Minimizing harm or refraining from directly causing harm?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it sort of points to the fact that, depending on which ethical framework you're coming from, you might get a different answer.
Right.
So like utilitarianism would say, minimize the harm overall if you have to do some harm.
Right.
But then deontology might say, well, no, there's a rule against killing. You can't kill.
Exactly. So the trolley problem, it doesn't give us easy answers, but it illuminates the inherent complexities and conflicts within our ethical systems.
And then, of course, you have all the variations of the trolley problem, which just make it.
Oh, yeah. Philosophers, we love to tweak these thought experiments to kind of push them to their limits and see where our intuitions break down.
One of the ones that I find pretty interesting is the safety net case.
Ah, yes. The safety net cases. These are a particularly fascinating subset of scenarios that really muddy the waters.
So what are those? Can you lay those out for the listener?
Yeah, so these cases involve situations where harm results from the removal of a protective barrier or safety measure. So imagine, for instance, a worker high up on a scaffolding. He's about to fall, but a safety net is in place to catch him. Someone removes the safety net, and the worker falls to his death. So, is this act of removing the safety net considered doing harm or allowing harm?
It's almost like a reverse trolley problem, right?
Right.
Instead of redirecting the harm, you're taking away something that would prevented the harm. So where do these cases fall?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and you guessed it, no easy answer.
Of course.
Some philosophers argue that all safety net cases should be classified as doing, emphasizing the active choice involved in removing the safeguard. Others maintain that it's still allowing because the ultimate harm comes from the pre-existing danger, the fall from the scaffolding in this case.
So it's about are we emphasizing the removal of the net or the fact that there was always a threat there in the first place?
Exactly, yeah. And it's a very subtle distinction, but it has these profound implications for how we assign moral responsibility.
And then, of course, to make things even more complicated, you have some people who say, well, no, this is actually a third category. This isn't doing or allowing. This is something else.
It's a testament to the complexity of the doing-galling distinction, that even with these seemingly clear-cut cases, we still grapple with nuances of agency, causation, and moral responsibility.
So we've got the trolley problem where we're choosing to cause harm, hopefully no minimize harm. We've got the safety net cases where we're removing something that would have prevented harm.
Right.
Both of those are blurring the lines.
Yeah.
And just when I thought we had gone as far as we could go, I came across this even weirder thing, which is the idea of letting yourself do harm.
Yes. Letting yourself do harm. This is where we really enter uncharted territory.
I've got to say, this one really messed with my head.
Yeah.
Can you sort of unpack this for our listener? How does this fit into the whole puzzle?
Yeah. So imagine this. You set a trap in the past, maybe unintentionally, without fully realizing the consequences. Now someone is about to walk into that trap, and you have the power to stop them. But to do so would mean, let's say, jeopardizing the lives of 5 other people. So do you prioritize preventing harm to this one individual who's about to walk into your trap, even if it means allowing harm to befall others?
So now we're talking about, it's not just what I'm doing right now, it's the consequences of things I may have done in the past.
Right.
Even if I didn't know what I was doing.
It forces us to confront this question. How far does our moral responsibility extend? Does it just encompass our present choices, or does it also encompass the ripple effects of our past actions?
Right. And then, to make things even more confusing, you've got these scenarios where letting yourself do harm involves a lack of control over your own body.
Right.
So maybe you have a muscle spasm that's going to cause you to involuntarily pull a trigger and maybe harm someone. So do you fight the spasm and risk harm, or do you let yourself do it, even though you didn't mean to?
These scenarios really highlight the complex interplay between our intentions, our agency, and the physical limitations of our bodies. They push us to consider whether moral responsibility hinges on conscious choice or whether it extends to actions we can't fully control.
Enigmar Person has written about this, right?
Yeah.
And he says that, we're often kind of torn between like what we want to do in the present and like recognizing there is a difference morally between ourselves and other people.
Right.
Like, do we hold ourselves to a different standard than we hold others?
Yeah, exactly. And I think a person's work highlights these inherent tensions within our moral reasoning. On the one hand, we feel a stronger sense of responsibility for our own actions, especially those that are intentional and deliberate. On the other hand, we recognize that harm is harm, regardless of the agent's intentions or their level of control.
I mean, it feels intuitively like letting yourself do harm it's worse than just letting harm happen.
Right.
But maybe not quite as bad as like going out and doing harm intentionally.
Right.
But how do you actually justify that?
Yeah. It really pushes us to the very limits of our ethical frameworks. It forces us to confront these very messy realities of human agency, responsibility, and the often unpredictable consequences of our choices. And as you pointed out earlier, we've only just begun to explore the many twists and turns this philosophical rabbit hole has to offer.
I think our listener's brain is probably hurting after all of that. I mean,
Yeah.
we went from that basic question, is there a difference between doing and allowing?
Right.
We went through trolley problems, safety net cases, now letting yourself do harm.
We've given them plenty to ponder, and we're not done yet.
Right, because, I mean, all of this has been in this hypothetical realm
Right.
of thought experiments. But how does this actually play out in the world? Like, how does this affect our laws, our medical practices, how we think about what we owe to other people, especially in a globalized society?
That's a question that deserves its own deep dive.
Well, then let's not keep our listener waiting any longer. In part 3, we're going to go beyond the hypothetical and look at the real world stuff, doing and allowing. Okay, so we spent the last couple parts of this deep dive really digging into the philosophical arguments around this distinction between doing and allowing harm, right?
Right.
We've been looking at definitions. We've gone through thought experiments. We've been trying to figure out, like, where does agency start and end? Where does responsibility lie? All that good stuff. But now I think it's time to see how all of this theoretical stuff actually plays out in the real world. How does this actually affect our laws, our medical practices, what we think we owe to other people, especially, in this big globalized society we live in?
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road. The doing-gallowing distinction isn't just this abstract philosophical puzzle. It has real practical implications for how we make decisions, how we create policies, and how we judge the actions of individuals and even nations.
So, like, give me some examples of how this actually shows up in different parts of, human life.
Well, let's start with the legal system, right? One of the most fundamental principles of criminal law is the concept of mens rea, which refers to the guilty mind, right? The criminal intent. And the difference between murder and manslaughter, for example, often hinges on this question of intent. Did the individual intentionally cause harm, or was it the result of negligence or recklessness or a failure to prevent a foreseeable harm?
Right.
And these distinctions draw very heavily on the due and gallowing framework.
So the law recognizes that there is a difference, morally and legally, between me going out and hurting someone and me failing to stop someone from getting hurt.
Exactly.
But then how does that get applied in those more like tricky situations where it's not so obvious, what someone's intent was?
Yeah, that's where things get really, really tricky. So think about cases involving corporate negligence, for example.
Right.
If a company fails to implement proper safety regulations and as a result, workers are injured or killed, is that considered doing harm or allowing harm? Was there this deliberate intent to cause harm? Or was it just a case of negligence, failing to foresee the potential consequences of inaction? These are the sorts of questions that judges and juries have to grapple with, and the doing-gallowing distinction provides this really useful framework for evaluating culpability and assigning responsibility.
So it sounds like this isn't just about like individual people, like did they do a crime or not? It's also about holding, corporations and institutions accountable for the stuff they do or the stuff they don't do.
Absolutely. And it helps us to navigate this really complex web of responsibility in a society where individuals, operate within these larger systems and structures. It's not always just about one person's choices. It's about the choices of these entities as well.
So moving beyond law, then, I'm curious to see how this plays out in medicine, where you have doctors having to make these really tough decisions about life and death.
Yeah, well, medicine is just rife with scenarios that challenge the doing-gallowing distinction. Think about end-of-life decisions, for example.
Yeah.
Is withdrawing life support consider doing harm or allowing nature to take its course?
Right.
Is there a moral difference between withholding treatment and actively administering a lethal dose of medication?
Right.
I mean, these are questions that patients and families and medical professionals have to confront, and the answers are rarely straightforward. There's just so much at stake in those cases.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, those decisions are so emotionally loaded anyway. It's probably even harder to be like, okay, well, what's the morally right thing to do here?
Absolutely. And it's not just about end-of-life decisions.
Right.
Think about the allocation of scarce medical resources. If a hospital has to choose between funding a life-saving treatment for one patient or providing basic health care to a larger population, are they doing harm by, choosing one over the other? Are they allowing harm by failing to meet the needs of all those who require care?
Right.
I mean, these are just such complex ethical dilemmas with really no easy solutions.
Wow. So it seems like the doing-gallery distinction, it's helpful in some cases, but in others, it kind of creates more questions than it answers, especially when you're dealing with, the messy real world where there's all these other factors going on.
Yeah, and that's the nature of ethical dilemmas. There rarely are these clear-cut black and white answers, but I think the doing gallowing framework, even with its limitations, gives us this starting point for analyzing these complex situations, for clarifying our intuitions, and for engaging in these meaningful dialogues about our values and our obligations.
And speaking of obligations, I'm really interested in how this plays out in terms of like what we think we owe to people in other parts of the world. Like, do wealthy nations have an obligation to help those who are, suffering in poverty or in conflict zones in other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a question that's been debated for decades, and it's closely tied to this distinction between positive and negative rights that we talked about earlier. If we believe that we have a duty to prevent harm, even when we haven't directly caused it, then that really changes our entire perspective on issues like foreign aid, humanitarian intervention, global poverty.
Right. So it's like, okay, do my obligations stop at my border? Or
Yeah.
do they extend to people I've never met and may never meet but are still suffering because of, just how the world is set up right now?
Exactly. It challenges us to really think about the limits of our responsibility, to grapple with the interconnectedness of our world, and to consider the consequences of both our actions and our inactions on this global scale.
Hmm.
And this is where things get, really challenging, I think, for a lot of people.
So we've seen how this doing gallowing thing shows up in law, in medicine, and even in, how we think about our role in the world as a whole. But I'm curious, like, how does this very old philosophical debate hold up in the face of, new science and, people trying to study ethics in, like, experimental ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it brings us to this really exciting field of experimental philosophy, which is often just called XFI. And this field really seeks to bridge the gap between traditional philosophical inquiry and empirical research methods.
XFI.
Yeah.
I've heard a little bit about this. It sounds like it's kind of shaking things up in the philosophy world.
It is. It's a really interesting field. And what XFI researchers are doing is they're using tools from psychology, from neuroscience, from behavioral economics, and they're using these tools to investigate our moral intuitions, to see how these intuitions are shaped by things like framing effects, how a problem is presented to us, by cultural background, maybe even by genetics.
So it's not just philosophers sitting in their armchairs thinking about this anymore. We're actually bringing data to the table.
Exactly. And this is really, I think, one of the big contributions of XFI. So, for example, studies have shown that the way a moral dilemma is framed can significantly influence our judgments about doing versus allowing. If a problem is presented in terms of potential gains, people are more likely to favor inaction, even if it leads to a worse outcome overall.
Okay.
But if the same problem is presented in terms of potential losses, people are more likely to favor action, even if it means causing harm. So the way we think about the problem can really affect our judgments.
So the way you ask the question matters. So it's almost like our intuitions about doing and allowing, they're not as fixed, as solid as we might think, right? They can be influenced by like these biases and these framing effects.
Yeah, absolutely. And this raises some really deep questions, I think, about the foundations of our ethical beliefs. If our intuitions are so easily swayed by these external factors, can we really rely on them as a guide for moral decision-making?
That's kind of a scary thought. So does that mean this whole doing gallowing distinction, is it just arbitrary? Like Is it just how our brains happen to be wired and not like some deep moral truth?
That's a question that's still very much up for debate. But what's clear is that XFi is challenging some of our long-held assumptions about the nature of moral reasoning, and it's forcing us to reconsider the role of intuition, emotion, cultural influences in how we form our ethical beliefs.
Wow, I think we've given our listener a lot to chew on today. We went from that very basic question,
Right.
is there a difference between doing and allowing?
Right.
We went through all those crazy thought experiments all the way to XFi.
We journeyed from the abstract to the concrete, from the hypothetical to the real world, and hopefully sparked some new insights along the way.
So, dear listener, after all of that, where do you stand? Is there this fundamental moral difference? Or is it all just about, the specifics of the situation, your perspective, how the problem is presented to you, maybe something to think about with, a glass of wine and a good philosophy book?
And until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.
And thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.